Hi there, it's Mr. Wyman, and I'm going to record read aloud of part of our science book. I really like this lesson. Um, it's about opinion versus evidence, and having evidence to back up what you think about something. It's okay to have opinions. It's good. We all do. We have opinions about everything, but it's important to know the facts and be able to support what you think. And sometimes you need to change your opinion. So, two girls just finished a sponge activity. They were surprised that their 4-gram sponge soaked up 32 grams of water. That seems like a lot for such a small sponge. As they recorded data in notebooks, Tisha said, "If we had a natural sponge, it would soak up even more water." "How do you know?" asked Kim. "I just know it would," replied Tisha. "Natural things are always better. I would always choose a natural sponge. I'm sure it would work better." "So you've never tested a natural sponge to find out if it can soak up more water than a synthetic sponge?" asked Kim. Hmm. Synthetic is a word that might be new to you. I wonder if we could use context clues in order to figure out what synthetic might mean. Let's read this one sentence of dialogue again. "So you've never tested a natural sponge to find out if it can soak up more water than a synthetic sponge?" asked Kim. "I think synthetic probably means the opposite or something opposed to natural sponge, like they're on opposite teams, right? Because there's this comparison or contrast between the natural sponge and the synthetic sponge." "Well, no, I never actually did the experiment," admitted Tisha, "but it makes sense to me that the natural sponge would soak up water better." Hmm. As good readers, we probably want to use the reading strategy of questioning, and Tisha should actually be using the strategy of questioning also. Why does she think that a natural sponge would do a better job? In what way does it make sense? "We could find out for sure," said Kim. "Let's get a natural sponge and test it. That should give us evidence about your opinion that natural things are better." Now, before we read on, is it possible that they do an experiment and come to find out a natural sponge does work better than a synthetic sponge or fake or man-made produced sponge? Yeah, that is possible. They could do an experiment and the natural sponge could very well behave better or work better than the synthetic one. Um, do you think that maybe because of the way this is written, that probably the natural sponge won't work as well? And it might prove that Tisha really ought to have had more evidence or more to back up her opinion than just "it makes sense"? Yes, probably. Like, as good readers and people who read a lot and see lots of themes in text, we probably know that something's coming that's going to kind of like um, either trick us or trick one of the characters, or make us understand something that wasn't understood before. So let's see. Here's an image of a synthetic or man-made sponge. Notice how perfectly square, or actually I should say rectangular it is. It's a rectangular prism. You could see this corner here, the three-dimension angles of it. And then here you have a natural sponge. They actually grow literally naturally in the oceans, and they are farmed and harvested and sold as uh, tools to be used. Um, and they are plants. They grow. Okay, let's see what happens here. So here's images in your science textbooks, and you can see it's pages 10 and 11 of your. Here we go. Here's the actual experiment. The next day, the girls stayed after school to do their experiment. They had a new synthetic sponge and a new natural sponge. So both were new, not having been used before, but there was a problem. The natural sponge was much larger than the synthetic one. Why would that be a problem? Well, they are already not equal because one's natural and one's synthetic. The idea when doing a scientific experiment is to keep everything as equal as possible and only have one, listen to this, variable different. So what's the variable in this instance? It's the natural versus non-natural or synthetic, right? So you need to keep everything else exactly the same because we're only testing that one variable. So what did they do? Tisha and Kim decided to cut 3 small samples from each sponge. The small samples would all be the same shape and same mass. They cut and trimmed and weighed carefully. Finally, it probably took several cuts, right? And they kept weighing it and figuring out what would be exactly the same. The small samples would all be the same shape and same mass. They cut and trimmed and weighed carefully. Finally, all 6 samples were exactly 5 grams. How should we soak the sponges to make sure it is a fair experiment? Asked Kim. Fair meaning equal, exactly the same for both sponges. I know, said Tisha. We can use a stopwatch to time 1 minute while we hold the sponges underwater. That will really soak the sponges. Then we'll take them out of the water. We will hold them over the basin for 30 seconds. Why would they do that? Well, so that they're not measuring water that comes out of the sponges, but they're measuring what the sponges actually hold inside of them, right? Then we will weigh them to find out how much water soaked into each sponge. That sounds good to me, agreed Kim. Let's get started. The girls soaked and weighed the first synthetic sponge. They repeated the procedure with the other 2 synthetic sponges. They did this to make sure their measurements were accurate. Then they did the same thing with the 3 natural sponges. They recorded their measurements in a table. Let's take a look at the table. Okay, look at this table. You've got here a label called sponge, right? And here you have synthetic 1, synthetic 2, synthetic 3, natural 1, natural 2, natural 3. And here's the mass, should be exactly the same. And then the mass of the wet sponge in grams, okay? Notice how they identify grams here. They don't have to put the G after every single thing. So once it's been soaked in water for a minute and then let to drip over the basin for 30 seconds, it then weighed 45 grams, the synthetic one. That means it took up how much water? 40 grams. All they did, what do you think they did in order to figure out the mass of the water? They subtracted the mass of the sponge from the mass of the wet sponge, which would be water and sponge combined, right? So in each instance, so they measured the weight of the sponge, synthetic and natural, wet, and then they subtracted the 5 grams each time. So that would be a pattern here. This is always going to be 5 grams less than this, right? See, 46 to 41, 45 to 40, 41 to 40, 36. Now, let's read what their interpretation of the data is. A second look. The girls studied the data. It looked like the synthetic sponge soaked up about 5 more grams of water than the natural sponge. Let's see. So the synthetic sponges, 45, 46, 45. And then the natural sponges, 41, 40, 39. Oh, yeah, look at that. So 5 more in the synthetic, the man-made sponges. Said Tisha. It looks like the natural sponge isn't better, at least not better at soaking up water. But you know what? I want to try one more thing. Let's squeeze as much water out of the sponges as we can. Then, starting with the damp sponges, we will repeat the experiment exactly. Then we will be sure our results are accurate. Kim thought this was a good idea. they repeated the experiment and recorded these data. And I have to say that I thought that this was really interesting that the science book, was telling the story and had this idea of using damp sponges. And I'll tell you a really quick story. When I was much younger, there was this commercial, like an infomercial on TV, and it was like this big thing called a sham wow. And this was a cloth that could be used in order to dry off or clean cars. Okay. And this guy, advertised it, and it was like kind of a joke because he was so enthusiastic and energetic about his sham wow. Well, the way the ShamWow worked, my parents actually bought, I think I was a kid when this was all happening. My parents actually bought either a ShamWow or something like a ShamWow. And at first we were like, what? This doesn't work at all. But guess what? The instructions tell you that you have to actually get it wet first, and you wring it out real good. Then it will collect like a miraculous amount of water. But it has to be damp in order to allow the water to collect in the material, right? You wring it out, and then you just keep wringing it out each time. But before you get it wet, it doesn't really work. It kind of repels the water, like pushes it away. So maybe that's what Tisha was thinking, or the authors of this book were thinking. There's a little background into this concept. So what happens? So now, because the sponges are all damp, they weigh a little differently. They're not 5 grams. You've got 788, 787. So they're still very similar, right? And they soak them in water. And again, it looks like they don't really collect any much more water, because 45, 46, 45, that reminds me of up here. Oh, it's exactly the same, 45, 46, 45. So it's not necessarily going to take in any more water than it did when it was dry, right? Because it already started with a couple grams of water, and then it only came up to this. That's like its max, it seems like, right? Maximum amount of water it can collect. And then the natural sponges are, again, no better being damp than the synthetic sponges having been damp. And they kept everything exactly the same. The only variable is whether it's natural or synthetic, right? So let's see what they have to say about that. Okay, I see now that synthetic sponge is better at soaking up water, said Tisha. So she was able to change her opinion, right? The evidence is right there for all to see. From now on, I am going to use synthetic sponges to soak up spills. But I will still use natural sponges for other things because they last longer. Wait, what is she basing that on? Kim asks, are you sure? Could they do another experiment in order to see if that's the truth? They probably could. Opinion. Tisha likes natural things. So this is the summation, the conclusion of this little story and this information that we're learning about opinion versus fact and evidence and how to form our opinions. Tisha likes natural things, and that's her opinion, and perfectly fine. She likes chairs made of wood. She likes t-shirts made of cotton. Her opinion is that natural things are always better. When she and Kim, and she probably has some evidence to base that on, even if it's just aesthetics, which means beauty or looks. When she and Kim were working with sponges, Tisha claimed that natural sponges were better. But now we're reading what already happened, right? So this is summing it all up. But her claim was not based on data and evidence. Her claim was her opinion. Opinions are based on what a person believes to be true, not on scientific data. Evidence is based on observation and scientific data. In science, claims are tested with experiments. Experiments produce data and evidence. The evidence will show if the claim is true or not true. Sometimes more experiments are needed to be done before a conclusion can be reached. When Tisha and Kim did their experiment, the evidence showed that the synthetic sponge soaked up more water. Tisha changed her mind about sponges after she studied the evidence. Thinking about opinions and evidence, Tisha claimed that natural sponges were better. What did she base that claim on? Why did Tisha and Kim repeat their experiment? Was Tisha's claim that natural sponges last longer based on an opinion or evidence? What is the difference between opinion and evidence?